to the downtown specific plan. Oh yeah, we are also going to be recording the session. So please click the got it on there. So we'll go over an introduction to the plan. I know some of you have been very involved in the plan, or at least have been to 1 or 2 sessions before. But for anyone who hasn't, we want to do an overview. We'll talk about what it'll do for Oakland and how. And then we'll talk about what the Downtown Oakland Specific Plan, or the DOSP, is proposing in the Victory Court area. And then we'll take questions and have a discussion based on what you're all interested in talking about. And to clarify, when we talk about the Victory Court area, because I know that's not a term that everybody is used to using, we are talking about this area in blue around here. And this is like a future projection of the area. This is all of downtown. And so this is the area that is that has the Victory Court running through it. And it's from Oak to all the way to the Lake Merritt Channel and between 880 and Embarcadero. So where we are on the downtown specific plan, it's been in development for quite a while. Some people thought it was already adopted. No, it's still in process, but we are hoping to adopt it later this year. We started actually at the very end of 2015 and into 2016 with a major 10-day public design charrette, an open studio, a youth summit, a lot of stakeholder meetings. But then we actually did a relaunch of it in 2017 and 2018 because we got a lot of feedback that there was concern that a plan that didn't have a strong focus on racial equity would lead to further displacement of residents of color and businesses of color in the downtown. So we worked with a racial equity consultant, added them to their team, did some expanded outreach, increased the membership of our community advisory group, and did some additional, a lot of additional outreach actually. From 2018 to 2019, we created several different iterations of the plan and got feedback on them at a number of different public hearings, whether formal hearings or events like here we have the Lunar New Year Festival and the Black Joy Parade. And then most recently from 2020 to now, we've been working on finalizing the draft plan, but really we've been focused on the zoning and the public review of the draft zoning. And then, as I said, hoping at the end of the year to move the plan forward to Planning Commission and City Council for adoption. So what will the downtown specific plan do? There are 7 main topics that the plan is addressing. Racial equity is one that is actually woven throughout the entire plan, whereas all of the other topic areas each have their own chapter. So housing and affordability, economic development, mobility, sort of accessibility and transportation, culture keeping, community health and sustainability, and land use and urban design are the main topic areas. So there's a goal associated with each one of those that the plan is working toward. The plan will help streamline production of both market rate and subsidized affordable housing. It'll facilitate it by providing some clear city guidance on what we're looking for, as well as environmental clearance. The plan will orient dense housing and employment to reach our environmental goals, which are clearly stated in our our equitable climate action plan. So the idea is to locate the highest density near the major transit centers, and particularly the BART stations, Lake Merritt BART and 12th and 19th Street. And it would also require community benefits in order to achieve the maximum density in key areas. And the community benefits that we have focused on are affordable housing, job training programs, neighborhood streetscape infrastructure or sea level rise improvements, depending on the area, public restrooms, and below market rate commercial space that are dedicated to primarily businesses and organizations run by or serving residents who have been harmed by racial inequities in Oakland. The plan will also generate funds through one-time development impact fees that will help subsidize affordable housing, transportation, and other capital improvements. And those impact fees are one-time only and can only be used for improvements rather than maintenance. But the plan will also generate long-term tax revenues that the city desperately needs. You've probably heard about the budget shortfalls. But those revenues can help build affordable housing. They can provide other city services, including parks and street maintenance, which the impact fees can't be used for. The plan is also designed to help us fill retail vacancies. We know that these were a problem even before COVID, but the pandemic and the shift to online retail has really exacerbated the problem. So the idea is to provide a combination of business development support, tenant improvement funds, a master tenanting program in partnership with nonprofit community-based organizations, and zoning that dedicates space in key cultural areas. And that's also in partnership with policies in the plan that would be implemented by departments throughout the city to facilitate like a safe and comfortable pedestrian environment, provide public restrooms, supporting the new macro program that resolves conflict without police, and then providing affordable housing to resolve homelessness. And finally, it will address sea level rise impacts. It will permit new housing in sea level inundation areas, of which the Victory Court area and Jack London and along the channel are definitely one. It would only permit those with comprehensive infrastructure and adaptation plans that would protect against flooding. And the plan also calls for some citywide and regional planning in addition to this site-specific planning to address the impacts of climate change. The way that the plan achieves these goals is that it sets policy. It sets a work plan for all of the different city departments who touch this, whether it's Department of Transportation, reviewing development applications or developing infrastructure improvements, or Public Works helping improve our parks, or housing, providing affordable housing. All of the departments coordinate together to implement the plan. And there are also a set of outcomes associated with the plan that we'll be monitoring over time. The plan also incorporates a racial equity framework and measures of success, overall measures of success and ones tied to the racial equity framework. The plan, at the same time as the plan is adopted, we will also be bringing changes to the general plan and to the planning code, also known as the zoning. There will be text changes to the planning code as well as changes to the zoning map, and those would be adopted at the same time as the plan. And the plan also certifies the environmental impact report. And one of the important things about that is that that reduces barriers to development if the development meets the intent of the downtown specific plan and meets all of the environmental mitigation measures that are contained by the environmental report. So one of the pieces that we've heard that have received a lot of attention is the zoning incentive program. And when I talked about community benefits, this is one of the ways that we're achieving additional community benefits in addition to those impact fees that help with affordable housing and capital improvements. The goal of the zoning incentive program is to encourage density in these places in the downtown, which are some of the most transit rich in the entire city. The goal is to provide that housing density that meets the state goals and our local goals for building new housing, including both providing affordable housing, potentially providing affordable units on site or through impact fees. And as I mentioned before, growing Oakland's economy and tax base to improve public services and fund community benefits throughout the entire city, because the downtown is really an engine of growth for the entire city. And to achieve additional community benefits by capturing additional value that development projects are able to achieve by the increased density and intensity that would be allowed under this plan. So the idea is that under this plan, the city would be allowing additional density beyond what's allowed now. And in return for achieving that, a project would provide community benefits. So it's a trade-off. And the way that works, just for a little bit more detail on it, is that we have what we call on the left, we're referring to as the base map. So that's the maximum height and intensity that would be allowed if they did not participate in the zoning incentive program for community benefits. So there's just an example of an arrow pointing to a property that would be allowed to be 45 feet. with a density of one residential unit for every 900 square feet. And then on the right, that same property could potentially, if they provided community benefits, get up to 175 feet of height and residential density of one unit for every 110 square feet. So much higher height and density. So turning to the Victory Court area, the vision for this area, and you'll see this image a lot, which is just a rendering that our consultants have put together of what this could look like. It's not actually a development proposal. It's just kind of taking a look at how much development this area could potentially provide to meet the community's goals. So what we're looking at here is a new cluster of dense housing, potentially around 6,000 new residential units that would help meet Oakland's housing crisis. And also commercial development. We're looking at, in this area, using this rendering, 850,000 square feet of a combination of community serving retail on the ground floor and office development. And I know that office is complicated right now as the switch to hybrid work has really impacted the office industry. So we're not just looking at office, we're looking at all sorts of employment uses, so long as they don't have a negative impact on the people living in the area. And so this would also involve new open spaces and pedestrian paths along Lake Merritt. And the idea is that this is a key area that provides connections between Brooklyn Basin, that's still under construction, but there's a lot going on there, and Jack London Square and Lake Merritt and the Lake Merritt BART station. Some of the steps that it would take in order to make this development happen. 3rd Street, which previously existed and a number of years back was actually vacated by the city, would need to be reconnected in order to create emergency vehicle access. And I'll go into that a little bit next. The Oakland Fire Training Facility, that is right by the channel now, would need to move. And there are plans in place or that are under development to move that to another location. The current Victory Court, which is not actually a legal city street. If the 3rd Street connection, the 3rd Street right of way was put back in place, then that Victory Court could be reallocated for development. And then also there would be improvements to open space along the channel and connections with the pedestrian path that runs along the channel. So a little bit more detail about that. The main elements are that reconnection of 3rd Street, and that is along here. So it's 3rd Street currently ends here, and right now, this is the Peerless Coffee building, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so 3rd Street, eventually, when Peerless Coffee, if and when Peerless Coffee decided to redevelop their site, this would eventually reconnect all the way through to the channel and then become a pedestrian path that could potentially become a rails to trails path across the old railroad bridge. And that would help connect bicyclists and pedestrians across the channel and then up to 5th Avenue. And folks from over here would then be able to take the path either on 3rd, the new 3rd, or would be able to take a pedestrian path that would run along Embarcadero and along the train tracks, all the way down to Fallon and then down to Oak, where there's the crossing to Estuary Park, either here or here. So that proposal would allow reuse of this old railroad bridge, and it would allow a connection to be made across the bridge that doesn't involve the bridge that is shown in this rendering. Let's see, I think I have another version of it. Let me just go back to that. Yeah, there's a version in this rendering that's an older one that shows this bridge that was being considered under Measure DD improvements, but basically it does not seem feasible for a number of reasons, including cost. And so we're looking at alternatives so that we can make that last connection between Lake Merritt and the waterfront. And so that connection would allow that. And as I mentioned, this area of the potential 3rd Street right of way from Fallon to the channel would potentially be easier since there isn't a building there. It's currently a parking lot. So if the property owners of this site were interested in developing their site, they would dedicate land for this 3rd Street right of way, which would allow emergency access and therefore allow the area to be developed. And that could potentially be done in a separate phase. So perhaps if this were easier, this could be done earlier on. And then in another however many years, the connection between Oak and Fallon could be made as well. So there are a lot of different options. This option also shows a potential pedestrian passageway between 3rd and this pedestrian path along Fallon, which also is currently not, there's a sort of a road that's an easement along here that's Fallon, but it's not an official street and for the purposes of fire. And so that would need to be reconnected as well to provide access for emergency vehicles to the dense development that would be envisioned here. So we have been involved in a lot of conversations with the Department of Transportation as well as the Oakland Fire Department. So they are, there have been a lot of conversations, so they're well aware of this and have provided a lot of feedback into what the options are. And this would also, as we're connecting along the path, the development would be allowed up to a point, but then there would be a 60-foot wide landscape buffer on both sides of the channel to allow for open space and to protect the channel as well from development. So there are a number of different options for 3rd Street. These are just a couple of examples. 3rd Street is on the city's bicycle master plan as an area for enhanced bicycle facilities and for making that connection eventually across the channel. So this is just one example of a configuration that could work for 3rd Street with elevated bicycle lanes in either direction. This is another potential example of a 2-way elevated cycle track on just one side. But again, this is pretty far into the future. What we're looking at right now is something that's just very conceptual. And that's what we're wanting to get everybody's feedback on. If this proposal moves forward, the idea is that as development were to occur, the details of the street, the details of the development would all be vetted at that time. So just a few more thoughts on the Victory Court concept. New development that would go in the area would be required to provide sea level rise site improvements. It would be required to go through a planned unit development process, both to, well, that would allow that additional scrutiny that I just mentioned of any new development, as well as any new pedestrian or vehicle streets. And it would also allow for a sort of comprehensive approach to sea level rise improvements. And then it would also be required to participate in the zoning incentive program to achieve the maximum height and density. And the maximum height and density, and we can direct you to look at the map in more detail. This is one of those areas where we mentioned that there is a base height and intensity, and then there is a height and intensity that can be achieved by participating in the zoning incentive program. So right now, our general plan, the City of Oakland general plan, calls for a mix of development, but the zoning is really industrial. There isn't an allowance in the zoning for residential, though the general plan calls for it. And that's one of the reasons that we're working on the zoning, is to bring those into conformance. But this map shows what would be allowed under the Downtown Specific Plan under the base height and intensity. So we're looking at mostly this area here, which is in height area 12 and then height area 8. And that goes from 65 feet for this one here, all of the green area, up to 135 feet with one residential unit allowed for every 250 square feet of lot area. And that would go up to a much higher height and intensity allowance if a property is participating in the zoning incentive program. And that would go, it would be lower near the channel, and then but still allowed up to 175 feet, because we're talking about wanting this to be a very dense node that connects to the waterfront and connects to Brooklyn Basin and connects to the Lake Merritt BART station. And it could potentially go up to 275 or 400 feet in this pink area here along Fallon. And so that would allow one residential unit for every, at the highest, for 90 square feet of lot area. So the city would be allowing a dramatic increase in height and density through the zoning in return for community benefits, including that necessary dedication of enough space to reconnect 3rd Street, which is required in order to make this development possible. And I am now going to turn it over to Neil to talk about the zoning changes. I've sort of been talking about the concept and the height and intensity, but Neil's going to talk about some of the zoning changes that we have proposed that would also go hand in hand with this. Neil?
Hi, everybody. So the Victory Court has special zoning in this area that's hatched, that has the purple oval around it. And in this area, the way the zoning is written, in order to do a new development or any sort of development, you would have to include buildings that are at least 100 feet tall and also participate in a PUD permitting process. And the reason why we're proposing that the buildings be so tall is so that there's a significant enough investment that the infrastructure can be upgraded, particularly because it's a flood zone. So there would be a significant infrastructure investment area. So, like I said, because of that, we were proposing these minimum heights with fairly high density. Yeah, next slide. These are areas that are subject to inundation because of sea level rise. So, and this includes obviously the Victory Court. And basically what this overlay requires is that any new development, any new construction, develop a adaptation plan for sea level rise. And as I mentioned before, there would be a PUD and infrastructure upgrade in the Victory Court requirement in the Victory Court area for any new development to significantly upgrade the infrastructure there. Next slide. We're also proposing a green loop all in this area that you can see in this slide. And in this green loop area, we're requiring kind of some setbacks in front of buildings to make room for seating areas, umbrellas, and landscaping to get kind of a consistent theme in this area. And along the channel, as was mentioned by Joanna, we're proposing a significant setback from the channel. First of all, to protect the channel from debris from the new development, but also to create landscaping, to create a sort of a landscaping transition from the channel to new development. And down the line, we're hoping to also find funding for ped and bike improvements in this area. So, next slide.
And I'll just add, Neil mentioned the significant setbacks, but we did just notice a bit of an error in the map. So this shows a very significant setback, and the setback would not be quite that significant here. So there are some other maps that we can share, and we can correct this before we send it out. That show more of the 60-foot setback that we mentioned.
Yes. So next slide. Yeah. This kind of reiterates what I just spoke about, just landscaping that really transitions from the channel to new development. Buildings would also be oriented towards the channel, so you could walk along the channel into your front door. And this is to develop all this. Obviously, it's going to require much more than just zoning. It's going to require a lot of future funding and grants, but that's what specific plans are for, to sort of vision for the future. Next slide. We've also created a new zone for under the freeway areas and in the for the underpasses, because it's been a real shame, obviously, that the freeway's there, because it really splits kind of Victory Court and London Square and the Jack London Square area from the rest of downtown. In the Victory Court area, what we're proposing is allowing sort of pop-up stores, recreational uses like skate parks, things like that, in the Caltrans lease areas. We are in the Victory Court area, we are allowing curb and gutter improvements for new parking, as well as landscaping. We're not allowing any new storage, because we found that regardless of how hard we try, storage just becomes blight after, very, very quickly after a few years. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Neil. So just one more slide, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. The next steps in the process, we've kind of highlighted all of the both the downtown specific plan and the associated zoning proposals for the Victory Court area, Eastern Jack London area. So some of the next steps are that we're going to take the feedback that we've been hearing over on the draft zoning amendments for the last year, and we'll take the feedback that we hear from you next at this meeting. We're going to develop an appendix that would guide the 3rd Street extension and how that would work based on the comments that we're receiving here and in some additional follow-up conversations. And then we would take the entire plan and the zoning amendments and the environmental review document through adoption hearings. They'll be going to the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board again. They've already been to the Zoning Update Committee, and it would also go to the Planning Commission and then the City Council, starting with its Community and Economic Development Committee. So those are sort of the next steps that we're envisioning. But before we go to that, we want to take all of your questions and hear your feedback. So maybe if we could start with questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. And once we've sort of answered clarifying questions and explained any questions that you have, then maybe we can go into some feedback. So I think there was a question. Oh, and also I saw that Ed Manassi, I mentioned that Ed Manassi, Deputy Director of Planning, was going to be joining us, and he is here as well. So Ed, you're also invited to jump in and answer any questions. And I see there was one question in the chat from Allison, which is asking what happened with DOT's plan to remove the Broadway Street off-ramp. And then I see Heather has her hand up. So actually, Ed, do you want to talk about the Oakland Alameda Access Project? And
sure, yeah.
What's happening there?
Yeah, the Oakland Alameda Access Project just received its last chunk of funding, a $25 million grant in a state allocation that I just read about in the last few days. So it's fully funded now for the first time in 25 years. And I think it's the schedule that I saw looked like it would be most likely it's supposed to be finished by 2027, so it would start late 2024, early 25 is my expectation. So it is absolutely still in the pipeline and now fully funded.
Great, thanks, Ed. Heather?
Okay, it's obvious that we need higher density. I'm trying to understand what 80 square feet per unit or 100 square feet per unit looks like. Is that like a single occupancy, an SRO building, or is it something else? So that's the first question. And then the second question is this plan related in any way to the tax initiative that Jack London residents were recently asked to vote on. I arrived a few minutes late, so I apologize if you already discussed that.
Sure. We didn't discuss that, and I would love to hear, I don't know much about the tax initiative. I don't know if that's something that somebody who's involved in JLID or maybe Ed could speak to. On the first one, just what that density looks like. So it's not an SRO necessarily.
It's not related to
an
the
apartment
unit.
or condo building.
Yeah, it's not related to the size of the building. It's related to how many. So it's a way of calculating density based on the size of a parcel. So if the density says you can have 1 unit per 80 square feet, so if you have that's a way of calculating how many units are allowed based on a size of a lot. Let's say 10,000 square feet. So you divide that 10,000 by 80 square feet, and that would give you how many units are allowed. And the units themselves can be of whatever size are proposed to us, but that's the max, that sets maximum density, is the calculation of square feet per lot size.
Okay, that's not something that a non-expert would know. So you
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you
We'll clarify that.
probably images would help, right?
Yes.
Or other examples. But basically, looking at some of the more high-rise apartment or condo buildings downtown is more what is more in the realm. Not necessarily an SRO. The SROs tend to be that we have that exist tend to be older buildings and are actually less tall.
Maybe one way it can be answered for us to understand is like we have a very high tall building like in Ellington, and then we have a relatively modestly tall building like a Sierra. So how does that work? Like 8-story versus 15-story, 20-story, that kind of thing.
That's a good question. Ed and Neil, are you more familiar?
Well, 80 square feet is quite dense. I mean, I believe the current density for the central part of downtown is around that same density. So it's a very high density. Neil, do you have a numbers as a comparison?
Well, I mean, I think that probably it would be easier for everyone to focus on the height limitation, because
Yeah, exactly.
Are going to look like, and the size of the units within those buildings, it's sort of up to the developer. It's just limited, but generally I think it's probably easier. People can more relate to the height of the building rather than looking at this density and trying to picture what a building is going to look like. Rather look at the height.
And we can also follow up. We can look at some examples of some buildings that are around different heights, and we could follow up because we have all of your emails who registered, and we could follow up and give you some images that are examples.
Yeah, and
sort of in that ballpark.
yeah,
Sorry,
I mean, there might be a bit. I'm sorry, John.
Go on.
Well, there might be a building that allows tons and tons of units, but doesn't have that great a height limit. So just kind of keep that in mind, that really, like I said, to picture it, maybe think about the height.
Yeah, that's probably most helpful. Unless you're wanting to build the building, in which case you're going to care a lot more about the density. And I see that there's a question in the chat. Is the Estuary Park project part of this plan? And I will say Estuary Park is part of the plan area, but the Estuary Park plan, my understanding is that that is sort of farther ahead than this process. But Ed, do you know anything on the latest?
No, I don't. I believe that it's they're still in design development or finalization. And then the question will be is whether that final design is sufficiently funded to move forward into construction. But we can get back to the folks on where that project stands.
So yeah, it is part of it's definitely part of the plan area, and it's part of the idea of that green loop and connecting all of the open spaces in the area and connecting all of both the green and blue spaces. that is the waterfront around the downtown. And just to follow up on that, the idea is not just making a loop around the downtown. The idea is that there are actually a couple different loops, and the idea is that they connect north, east, west, so that we are bringing in all of the rest of Oaklanders to the downtown and to the waterfront and to the lake and the channel to take advantage of all of those things. So it's not sort of cutting off, but inviting connections. Yes, and Mark says all of this is unrelated to the Jack London Improvement District tax. That is true. It is unrelated, but if there is somebody here who wants to like give a brief synopsis of the Jack London Improvement District tax, do you want to? Is there anyone here who would want to? Okay, if not, that's fine. But yeah, that is not something that we're working on as part of this plan. And I see another question in the chat. Does the expansion mean that the buildings currently housing Peerless, Cash and Carry, and the buildings behind them will be demolished? Ultimately, if they chose to develop that, then yes, they would be reconfigured. If Peerless wanted to stay there, they could redevelop the property and have ground floor production and then have residential above. But that would all be, and that's part of the zoning, not so much the incentive program, but that's part of the incentives for the zoning, that those areas could be redeveloped at much higher density in return for dedicating the space along it, which would be a small portion of the parcel. Any other questions about that? Okay. Any other questions about the concept? Are there any points of confusion, or should we go into, I would invite further questions, but we could also just go into, do you have any feedback on this? How do you feel about it? How do you feel about it as a resident? How do you feel about it as a business or property owner? What, yeah, Nadine, go ahead.
So this is all a lot of new information, but it seems like it's been work that's been talked about for a long time. So what kind of timeline for any of this? I mean, are we talking 20 years away? Or
yeah,
what?
that's a good question. We are talking potentially 20 years away. It depends. So the Downtown Specific Plan has a 20-year horizon. And so there is an implementation matrix, and there are some actions in the plan that we're looking at like 5 years, but some of the big infrastructure changes like this, that would require installing a new road and some major pedestrian infrastructure. And then like that's a little bit longer term out. And then a lot of it will depend, because we're not, I think someone was concerned at one point that we were talking about like using eminent domain to take people's property, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about creating an incentive for property owners in this area to develop their property. And as part of that, the ones along that right of way of 3rd Street would dedicate that as part of it. So, we are looking at sort of a far off timeline. But a lot of it really depends on the property owners and what they're interested in doing. And then the infrastructure would come along with that, because the development and the impact fees that would come along with the development it would also contribute to all of the infrastructure in the area. So it would all need to happen at the same time. Yeah, Ed, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to add to that, as far as the timeline for individual property owners to move forward, that is an unknown. We can't, it could be as soon as we adopt the regulations, or it could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. That'll be the decision of individual property owners. So the regulations would allow it, and it will happen or not happen depending on whether a particular property owner finds it in their interest to move forward under new regulations. What will take, you know, the full length of the time, you know, the timeline is the big moves of infrastructure and bridges and new streets and such. That will happen over a considerable amount of time as funding becomes available. But individual property owners will move forward on their own time frame if they move forward at all. The regulations will allow something new, and we'll see if the market responds.
Yeah, so that's kind of what the plan does. It puts in place a concept, it puts in place the infrastructure, the policy infrastructure for it all to happen.
Yeah.
But then a lot of it relies on the market to actually be built.
Mhm.
And I'm seeing a couple of other questions in the chat. One related to that, which is if Peerless is not interested in making any changes to their footprint, then the 3rd Street extension wouldn't be implemented. I did mention that there is a possibility of a couple different phases. So say Peerless, the Peerless owners weren't interested in anytime soon redeveloping and helping create the 3rd Street extension from Oak to Fallon. There's a possibility that if the other property owners along the 3rd Street wanted to redevelop, then that could be created as a phase 1 and then eventually reconnected. So if we're able to reconnect, if we're able to connect Fallon with an official street that is wide enough for fire access, then we could potentially have that area of 3rd Street from Fallon to the channel as a phase 1. And then I see the question about what kinds of inundation, sea level rise infrastructure improvements could come with the new buildings. And I think that's a lot of that is still to be determined, and a lot of it will depend on the site. Each project that gets proposed will need to do its own, and this is one of the reasons that we're requiring a planned unit development, will need to do its own study and create its own adaptation plan. So whether that's, raising the level, and I think there are actually some specific requirements in the plan as well about increasing the level of the site. But there are probably a lot of other improvements that are going to be required as well that we're going to need to be figuring out as we move ahead. But we are putting that in place, that it is a requirement. And to some extent, some of them will be left up to the individual developer to prove that they are providing adequate protection for the site. But then we're also looking at sort of site-wide. So one of the options in the zoning incentive program is that a developer participating in it could provide funding or improvements not to their own site, but that would support the entire neighborhood in terms of sea level rise. So that's another piece to it, is the sort of neighborhood level infrastructure. And we're going to be looking at that more in the future as we're collaborating with regional bodies to create regional infrastructure plans for sea level rise as well. Let's see, other questions. Curious about the process. How do we see it all through? Would be neat if the team would be here for 20 years, but many of us won't be here either. Is there a year-by-year check-in on the progress? There is not necessarily year by year, but we are planning on regular check-ins on the process. As I mentioned, there are measures of success for the plan, and we put those in there very intentionally because we want to make sure that we are tracking those on a regular basis, so that if we need to, we can come back to the policies and see what is maybe not working and shift them as needed. And the good news is that we have actually hired a number of new planners recently. So we do have more capacity than we have had in the past for doing that. So we're very hopeful that we'll be able to do that. Let's see, shorter timeline question related to the downtown specific plan generally. Likelihood approval. Is the mayor behind this? How about the city council members, planning commission, et cetera? How realistic is approval of the plan by the end of 2023? We definitely don't have a crystal ball as planners, but we have met with the new mayor and given her presentation. She asked very thoughtful questions. So, all we can say is that she is really wanting the best for downtown. She's putting a lot of energy in trying to make downtown more active. So this plan really aligns with her goals for the downtown. We've had a lot of changes because this plan has been going on for so long. In the council makeup, we're having some changes to the planning commission that are going on right now. So we're working to create briefings with all of the new elected officials to get any of their questions answered and see how the goals of the plan might align with their goals. So we think that it's pretty realistic that we could get approval of the plan by the end of the year. But again, we don't necessarily have a crystal ball. I don't know if any other staff want to add on to that. No, okay.
No, I think you nailed it. That's good.
And is any additional transit planned to handle all the additional residents on top of the Brooklyn Basin residents? So that is something that I mean, we have tried in the plan to ensure that transit in terms of like AC transit, that we're talking with them, and that new development would lead to higher increase in service. So I think it depends again on the development. If the development is moving forward at a high density, then absolutely we're going to be working with AC transit to make sure that the transit plans keep up with it. So it really depends. Obviously, we can't put in the new transit before the new development happens. But as the new development is happening, we will be in communication with our Department of Transportation and working with AC Transit. We're also working, on the regional Link 21 project, which is talking about adding a second Transbay crossing, which very likely part of it will go through Oakland. And so the alignment for that is still very up in the air, and we're involved in those conversations, and they are going out to the public this summer. In fact, I think they're actually tomorrow at 12th Street BART tabling to get feedback from the public, and there's going to be an open house on the 21st. So you're all welcome to participate in that process. We're participating in it as well. But so there is absolutely planned in the future an increase in transit capacity to deal with the development in Oakland and the development in the region as well. Do we have any short-term plans, 1.5 years, that we can implement that would improve the neighborhoods? That's a really good question. So we're hoping that the zoning that we put in place obviously is more of a longer term plan. But the plan itself does have a number of short-term actions. But a lot of that's sort of those more short-term actions are not so much these long-range 20-year plans, but there are a lot of departments in the city that are working on those right now. There are a lot of collaborations between the city and between the business improvement districts, for example, to try and activate public spaces and in order to both reduce crime, but increase activation of businesses and bring more people into the downtown. I think I mentioned the macro program that is working on supporting conflicts in the downtown without the use of police. There have been a number of different public safety interventions, and actually I know that we have folks from the neighborhood councils here if they want to speak to anything that they know of that's going on. Housing and community development is working every day on permitting new housing, and some of that is in the process of going up in terms of affordable housing to try and make sure that we are providing housing for all of our unhoused residents. So there are a number of actions throughout the city all of the departments are taking that are making these more short-term improvements. Neil, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, and I guess I'd also add that, new developments will come in the next year and a half, and we're in the process of developing design guidelines for not just downtown, but for the rest of the city. But the downtown design guidelines are taking a priority, and we're hoping that those will improve the design quality of new development coming in.
Thanks, Neil. And yeah, Heather, I see the follow-up. Not hearing specific examples of plans. That's because I can't necessarily speak for the other departments and what they're doing. I would be happy if there are some specific questions, we can go to our colleagues in business development and in housing and community development and human services and find out specifically what they're doing. I'm afraid as a planner, I'm not necessarily tapped into absolutely everything that's going on around the city, but happy to answer sort of if you have questions about specific areas or specific topics, we can go to our colleagues and find out some answers and get back to you.
So Joanna, I mean, I think most of us on this call sort of know what the real problems are with the neighborhoods. I mean, having to do with crime and just the encampments in the area. And I mean, I'm sure there are other problems as well, of course, but those are the things that impact us on a day-to-day basis. And in talking with many residents, we just don't feel like anything is being done about these very visible issues. And of course, we would be delighted if something was done. And we understand how challenging these problems are.
Yeah, understood that those are challenges that you're experiencing every day as you walk around your neighborhood. And I can guarantee you that people are working on it, and that there are a number of staff, hundreds of staff who are every day are working on cleaning up illegal dumping and are working to make sure that we are getting residents housed so that those encampments can be cleaned up once folks are in homes. It does feel overwhelming, I think, to a lot of people about what conditions are in their neighborhoods. And I'm seeing Ed has his hand up, and if we go to Ed and then, yeah, go ahead. And then Tripathis and then Nadine.
Well, I just saw a comment come up about the 880 as being a barrier. Absolutely. And there's a number of really positive things happening in the 880 corridor. One is the Oakland Alameda Access Project, which by taking down the Broadway on-ramp and reopening 6th Street, that that area of where 6th Street kind of stops and starts, and because of its lack of activity and kind of being back of house infrastructure wise, has become fruitful ground for encampments and such, and that will necessarily change as it becomes a street. It becomes a more active edge to both Jacqueline and Chinatown. And then in addition to that, I believe there is active design and maybe even funding for improvements to the Broadway underpass, which is amazing after many years. And so we'll have to get updates from DOT to see if that is the timeline for that moving forward. And then on a small note, the Caltrans did not put out a parking lease for the parking lot that's that's kind of between Webster and Webster Place. It's kind of the right under the freeway there. That parking lot that kind of that was all long envisioned as a potential extension of the Webster Green. So it is an open palette now for something hopefully better than parking. And that can happen whenever there is funding and a plan put forward to do so. But it is just the fact that it's not a parking lot right now makes it feel more inviting, I think, walking through there.
Yeah. And I'll also add that we, as the Downtown Specific Plan staff, have been involved in the conversations with the county about their buildings on either side of Broadway at 880, just south of the freeway. And so, you know, the Downtown Specific Plan and the goals for having much more active uses along there and more active, like more interaction with the street than those current buildings provide, which are kind of terrible entrances to the Jack London area. And so they incorporated those into their request for proposals. So as they're redeveloping those sites, they are definitely talking about making improvements to the freeway underpass there and making a much more pleasant pedestrian environment to connect between Jack London and Broadway. And I want to go back to Tripathis had their hand up.
Yes, please.
And then Nadine, sorry, how do you say it?
Manoj Tripathi.
Hi, Manoj.
Basically, when I'm listening to you for the last 50 minutes, this is my net. What this is basically you have created guardrails to allow 8 to 10 to 15 story development on the south side, which is the Victory Court side, which is currently 1 to 2 story. It is going to go to 10, 15 story. And you are making it in a way that protects the channel and the estuary and all that. So basically, it's going to be in 10 to 15 to 20 years, based on economic interests of the property owners, they will be allowed to go up, so to speak. And when they go up, the rest of the area will be developed with the roads and the emergency access and so on and so forth. Is that the basically the net of the whole thing?
Yeah, that sounds very accurate. The development that happens is based on private development, but we try and put in the infrastructure and the policy to guide that development and make sure that the community infrastructure goes in along with it. And that development actually meets the goals that we've been hearing from the community. So yes, that is a good summary, I think, of how the specific plan functions. Thank you. Let's go to Nadine, who had her non-virtual hand up.
Yeah, because it was too hard to figure out how to do that. So again, go back to there's a lot of long-term stuff here. 2 people ago, there was a little bit of information about short-term, doing something better for the walking under Broadway, which no one wants to do right now, and other things like that. What's the vehicle that we as residents can learn more about what's going on short-term? Because I feel like, and maybe it's just because I just don't know, but there's a gap here. I'm happy to know that 20 years down the line, maybe if things all align, stuff will happen and we need to lay the things in. But how do we find out more and maybe even help promote more of what's in the 0 to 5 year plan?
Yeah, and are you involved at all in the local neighborhood council, or are you aware of it?
My husband and I are homeowners at the Ellington.
Okay, then I would say, and I know Brenda Ivy, who is the staff person from the city who works with the neighborhood council, and I know Jennifer Newman is here, who is on the neighborhood council. That's one of the best ways that the city has of communicating with neighbors about what the neighbors' concerns are and what the city is actually doing to address those concerns more in the near term, rather than obviously these plans that are like 20 years out, though there will be work done in the interim. But I don't know, we're happy to share information about those. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to make a pitch for people attending those meetings or not. But I see you're unmuting.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, we welcome, so the Neighborhood Crime Prevention Council, I think it's going through some name changes, but, and Brenda can speak a little bit more to this, being community resources. I feel like we do talk a lot about the sort of pain points, the crime that does happen in the neighborhood, and sort of how we can, as residents, get ahead of that, and with support of our local police department. But we also do speak a lot on the Jack London Improvement District, and we share events and activities, and also progress or any type of meeting recaps from that. And also Sevlon, our director of the Jack London Improvement District, attends all of our prevention, our crime calls. So once a month, we do get a lot of insight. So it's not just crime related, it's really sort of hyper focused on Jack London. So I would encourage everybody, if you want to just pop in, it's a Zoom call. So it's kind of open for anybody to join, and we do it once a month. So I'll just put information right here in the chat and my email.
Great.
I'm happy to send you the Zoom info.
Thank you. We got invited to this event. I don't know how to get invited to that. So if you can put that in, that would be great.
You got it.
Great,
Thank you.
And I can add just a little bit of additional context from the city side on those. They are undergoing a name change from crime prevention councils to neighborhood councils, and that actually is not just a function of name change, but they have been moved from the police department under the city administrator's jurisdiction. So they are expanding beyond the idea of just crime prevention, though that is still obviously pretty central, to how is the city serving the neighborhoods more broadly. And there's like a neighborhood enhanced services team that is working as well. So the city is sort of figuring out how that all works, but they are moving in that direction. And I'm going to go to the chat because I know there were a couple more questions. Are there specific plans in process for other areas in the city that contemplate this level of density? So the Downtown Specific Plan is the only specific plan that is currently under development. And it's the downtown is sort of the most dense area, and the areas right by transit are the areas where we want the most development. So that's where we're contemplating that. But also what's happening right now is an update to the city's general plan, which hasn't been updated in something like 40 years. It's been a very long time. It's overdue, and phase 1 has already started with the housing element, which was state mandated, as well as an environmental justice element and a safety element. But phase 2 is going to be kicking off this fall, and that is going to be focused on a number of different aspects, but including the land use and transportation element of the city's general plan, which is sort of its guiding document for how the entire city grows. So as a result of that, there may be some further specific plans, but we will be looking at increased density sort of throughout the city, particularly around those major transit stations. So no other specific plans underway, but yes, that is definitely being looked at. Let's see, I think that was just a comment from Britta on having participated in an Involved C public workshop, getting input on the ground floor spaces for new affordable housing buildings planned. Oh yeah. Okay, so those are the buildings that we were talking about, the county buildings. So that's great. That's great. I'm glad to hear that you were involved in that process. And also mentions that there are email newsletters from Bike Walk Alameda and the Jack London Improvement District. So for those of you who want to find out more about what's going on in the area, it sounds like you could get on those mailing lists as well. And thank you, Jennifer, for adding that information in the chat about how folks can get involved in the neighborhood council meetings. It is 7:08. We had told you that the meeting was going until 7:30, so we do have a little bit more time. If folks have more questions, or if you want to give any feedback, if there's anything you haven't said, your feelings about any of the graphics that we've shown, or the planning, anything like that, would be happy to answer any questions. But if not, we can also wrap up. And you are welcome to contact us. We will put this presentation up on our website. We will send it out to all of you since we have your email addresses. You can feel free to contact us via email, plan Downtown Oakland at I'm just putting it in the chat, oaklandca.gov. You can email us there and it'll make it to the whole team. And yeah, if there's anybody else you know who didn't make it, we are recording this session, so they'll be able in a few days to see the recording of this. And yeah, I see Britta is an old Oakland homeowner who's excited about the plans, especially the green loop. Walk in Estuary Park a lot and look forward to the connection to the lake someday. Yeah, I think it'll be great to connect all of those waterfronts. All right, well, thank you all. We really appreciate your time. And feel free to follow up if you do have additional questions, and we'll send out additional information on some of those questions that we said we would look into further information on. Thanks.